The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in courtroom 4B as Judge shuffled through paperwork on what she assumed would be another tedious Tuesday. Outside, the California sun blazed mercilessly over Riverside County, the temperature already climbing toward 95 degrees before noon. But inside the courthouse, the air conditioning created an artificial chill that made spectators pull their jackets and shift uncomfortably in the hard wooden benches. Sarah Mitchell sat ramrod straight in her chair at the plaintiff's table, her knuckles white as she gripped her worn leather purse. At 32 years old, she looked a decade older, dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her nurse's uniform, which she'd worn straight from her night shift at Riverside Community Hospital, was wrinkled and carried the faint smell of antiseptic. She hadn't slept more than 4 hours in days, her mind constantly racing through worst-case scenarios about today's hearing. This custody battle had consumed her life for the past 8 months, draining her savings, her energy, and nearly her sanity. Across the aisle, separated by what felt like an ocean of animosity, sat her ex-husband David Preston. At 35, he still maintained the muscular build from his years in construction, his forearms thick and tan from long days working under the sun. He checked his watch for the third time in 5 minutes, his jaw clenched so tight a muscle twitched visibly in his cheek. David's navy suit looked expensive, far more expensive than anything he could afford on a construction supervisor's salary, Sarah thought bitterly. His new girlfriend must have bought it for him. Everything about his appearance was calculated. The fresh haircut, the polished shoes, the humble expression he'd practiced in the mirror. He was playing the role of the wronged father to perfection. Between them, like a living, breathing reminder of what they'd lost, sat their 3-year-old daughter Emma with a court-appointed guardian named Mrs. The little girl's pigtails bobbed as she swung her legs, too short to reach the ground from the adult-sized chair. Her light-up sneakers flashed pink and purple with each movement, a cheerful contrast to the somber atmosphere of the courtroom. She clutched a worn stuffed rabbit that Sarah had given her that morning, something familiar to provide comfort in this strange, intimidating place. Emma seemed oblivious to the tension crackling through the room like electricity before a storm, but Sarah knew better. She could see it in the way Emma's fingers worried at the rabbit's ear, pulling at a loose thread over and over. The custody hearing had been scheduled for 9 o'clock, but it was now approaching 9:30 and they were still waiting for the judge to address their case. Sarah's attorney, Michael, no relation to the judge, was a public defender who juggled 17 other cases. He was competent but overworked, and Sarah knew she couldn't afford anyone better. Meanwhile, David had somehow secured the services of a shark in a suit who specialized in fathers' rights cases, and had a reputation for making mothers look like hysterical, vindictive liars. Sarah watched Emma from across the room, her heart physically aching. It had been 4 days since she'd been allowed to see her daughter, 4 days that felt like 4 years. The current custody arrangement gave David Wednesday overnight visits and alternating weekends. Every single time Emma returned from her father's house, she seemed more withdrawn, more anxious. She'd started having nightmares 2 months ago, waking up screaming about the bad thing but unable or unwilling to explain what she meant. At 3 years old, Emma's vocabulary was still developing, and she struggled to articulate complex emotions or experiences. Sarah had documented everything. The mysterious bruises that David explained away as playground accidents, Emma's sudden fear of loud noises, the way she'd started wetting the bed again after being potty trained for 6 months. She'd taken Emma to their pediatrician doctor, who had noted behavioral changes consistent with stress, but found no definitive evidence of physical abuse. Without concrete proof, Child Protective Services had declined to investigate, suggesting instead that Emma's behavior was a normal reaction to the divorce. "All rise," the bailiff's voice cut through Sarah's thoughts. Judge entered from her chambers, her black robe swishing as she climbed the steps to the bench. At 58 years old, Judge had presided over family court for 2 decades. She'd seen everything, or so she thought. Her face was impassive, professional, giving nothing away as she settled into her seat and surveyed the courtroom over her reading glasses. "Please be seated," she said, her voice carrying easily through the room despite its moderate volume. Case number FC 20197834, Mitchell vs. Preston, continued custody hearing. She glanced at her notes, then looked up at the assembled parties. "Counselors, are we ready to proceed?" Both attorneys stood and affirmed they were ready. Judge nodded and turned her attention to the documents before her. "We're here today to address Mr. Preston's petition for expanded custody, specifically requesting a modification from Wednesday overnight visits and alternating weekends to a 50-50 split custody arrangement. Ms. Mitchell has filed an opposition along with a counter-petition to reduce Mr. Preston's visitation to supervised visits only." The judge's eyes moved from Sarah to David, her expression giving away nothing. "These are serious allegations on both sides. Mister, you may begin with your opening statement." Sarah's attorney stood, straightening his tie. "Your Honor, my client is deeply concerned about her daughter's welfare during visits with Mr. Preston. We have documentation of behavioral changes, unexplained injuries, and statements from the child herself that suggest. Objection, shot to her feet like a coiled spring released. Your Honor, Ms. Mitchell has consistently attempted to alienate the child from her father through inflammatory and unsubstantiated accusations. This is a textbook case of parental alienation syndrome, and we have experts prepared to testify. Ms., you'll have your turn, Judge interrupted calmly. Please sit down, Mr. Continue. As the attorneys began their carefully rehearsed arguments, Sarah's eyes drifted back to Emma. The little girl had stopped swinging her legs. She sat very still now, her head tilted slightly as if listening to something no one else could hear. Her eyes had moved away from the stuffed rabbit and were focused somewhere toward the back of the courtroom. Sarah followed her daughter's gaze but saw nothing unusual, just the regular courtroom fixtures, a few spectators waiting for other cases, and the heavy wooden doors that led to the hallway. The guardian ad assigned to Emma, noticed the change in the child's demeanor too. She leaned down and whispered something to Emma, probably asking if she needed to use the restroom or wanted some water. But Emma didn't respond. She just kept staring toward the back of the room, her little body growing more tense with each passing second. Sarah felt a flutter of anxiety in her chest. She knew that look. It was the same expression Emma wore when she was about to have one of her episodes, the crying fits that would come out of nowhere, triggered by things Sarah couldn't predict or understand. Please, not now, Sarah thought desperately, not in front of the judge. David's attorney would use it as evidence that Emma was unstable, that Sarah was coaching her to act out. The courtroom clock ticked toward 9:45. Outside, a siren wailed in the distance, growing louder then fading away. Inside, the battle for Emma's future continued with legal arguments and procedural motions, everyone following the carefully prescribed dance of family law. None of them, not the judge, not the attorneys, not even Sarah, realized that in just a few moments everything was about to change. The ordinary Tuesday morning was about to become extraordinary, and 2 words from a 3-year-old girl would expose a truth so horrifying that it would make headlines across the nation and change the family court system forever. But first, someone else needed to enter the courtroom. No one noticed when Officer Jake slipped into the back of the courtroom at exactly 9:47 a.m., his K-9 partner Rex padding silently beside him on the polished marble floor. The heavy wooden door closed behind them with barely a whisper, the hydraulic hinge designed specifically to prevent disruptions during proceedings. Moved with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd spent 8 years in law enforcement, finding a seat in the last row of spectator benches where he and Rex could wait without drawing attention. Rex was a 4-year-old German Shepherd, 75 pounds of muscle, intelligence, and discipline. His coat was the classic black and tan coloring that most people associated with police dogs, a rich saddle of black across his back and shoulders, with tan markings on his legs, chest, and face. His ears stood at perfect attention, swiveling occasionally to track sounds throughout the courtroom. But despite his alert posture, Rex was the picture of professional calm, settling at his feet with a soft exhale, his body relaxed but ready. Ran his hand affectionately along Rex's head, feeling the familiar texture of the dog's fur under his fingers. They'd been partners for 3 years now, ever since Rex had graduated from the intensive K-9 training program in San. In that time, they'd become something more than handler and dog. They were a team, each anticipating the other's movements and moods with an almost supernatural awareness. Rex had been responsible for over 40 successful drug interdictions, had helped locate 2 missing children, and had once tracked a robbery suspect through 3 miles of rough terrain in the Sand Mountains. The German Shepherd was a legend in Riverside County, known not just for his success rate but for his temperament. Unlike some K-9 units that were aggressive or unpredictable, Rex had a disposition that made him perfect for community outreach. Children at elementary school demonstrations would line up for the chance to pet him. Senior citizens at neighborhood watch meetings would bring him treats. Had even taken Rex to visit patients at the children's hospital, where the dog's gentle nature brought smiles to kids going through chemotherapy. Today they were early for their next case, a routine drug possession hearing scheduled for 10:30, right after this custody battle wrapped up. Had in dozens of cases over the years explaining how Rex had alerted to narcotics in vehicles, homes, and storage units. It was straightforward work and had learned to use the downtime between cases to catch up on paperwork or, like now, simply observe the fascinating theater of the American legal system. He pulled out his phone and began scrolling through emails, Rex's leash looped loosely around his wrist. The custody hearing droned on at the front of the courtroom. He caught fragments about visitation schedules and behavioral reports but tuned most of it out. He'd been through his own divorce 3 years ago, thankfully without children involved, but the process had been painful enough to give him sympathy for anyone going through family court. Rex shifted slightly at his feet, his ears twitching. The dog's head lifted, his dark eyes scanning the courtroom with sudden interest, glanced down, noting the change in his partner's posture. "What is it, boy?" he whispered, barely audible. Rex's tail gave a single wag, not excited, just acknowledging his handler's voice, but the dog's attention remained fixed on something toward the front of the courtroom. Followed Rex's gaze and spotted a little girl sitting with an older woman in the front section. The child was small, probably 3 or 4 years old, with pigtails and light-up sneakers that kept flashing as she moved her feet. She was clutching a stuffed rabbit and seemed to be paying no attention to the legal proceedings happening just feet away from her. But then something changed. The little girl's head turned slowly as if drawn by an invisible force. Her eyes, even from this distance, could see how wide they'd become, locked onto the back of the courtroom, locked onto Rex. Felt the atmosphere shift before he could consciously identify what was happening. It was the same sixth sense that had kept him alive during his 3 years in the army before joining the police force, the instinct that warned of danger before the mind could process the specifics. The little girl's entire body had gone rigid, her small hands squeezing the stuffed rabbit so hard her knuckles turned white. Rex sensed it too. The German shepherd's ears flattened slightly, not in aggression but in confusion, his head tilted to one side in that quintessentially dog-like gesture of puzzlement. He looked up as if asking, "What's happening? What did I do?" The woman sitting with the child, the guardian, assumed, leaned down to say something, but the little girl didn't respond. She just kept staring at Rex with an intensity that was unsettling in someone so young. Her breathing had become rapid and shallow, her chest rising and falling visibly even from across the courtroom. At the plaintiff's table, a woman in nurse's scrubs, presumably the mother, had noticed her daughter's distress. Her head whipped around following the child's line of sight, her face creasing with concern. She half rose from her seat, but her attorney's hand on her arm stopped her. The proceedings continued, the lawyers still arguing about overnight visitation percentages and holiday schedules, oblivious to the drama unfolding in their midst. Felt Rex tense beneath his hand. The dog wasn't growling or showing any signs of aggression. Rex never did unless specifically commanded or facing a genuine threat. But something was clearly wrong. The German shepherd's confusion was palpable, his head now lowered, his eyes soft and almost apologetic as he stared back at the little girl. "It's okay," Rex murmured, keeping his voice calm and reassuring. "Easy, boy, you're fine, you didn't do anything wrong." But even as he said the words, knew they were about to be tested. The little girl's face had transformed from rigid fear into something else, something that looked like recognition mixed with terror and, strangely, a desperate kind of courage. Her mouth opened slightly, and could see her drawing in a deep breath, preparing to speak. The courtroom clock ticked to 9:51 a.m. Judge was asking one of the attorneys to clarify a point about supervised visitation protocols. The court reporter's fingers flew across her stenotype machine, recording every word for the official record. The bailiff stood by the judge's bench, his hand resting casually on his belt, watching the proceedings with the practiced boredom of someone who'd seen 1,000 such hearings. None of them were looking at the little girl. None of them saw her mouth open wider, her tiny body gathering every ounce of courage a 3-year-old could muster. None of them were prepared for what was about to happen next. Saw it, though? He watched as the child's fear transformed into action, as something inside her small frame decided that this exact moment, surrounded by judges and lawyers and official authority, was safe enough to finally speak the truth she'd been carrying. Rex whined softly, a questioning sound deep in his throat. His tail tucked slightly, not in fear but in canine confusion at the distress he was clearly sensing from the small human across the room. The German shepherd had been trained to detect narcotics, to track suspects, to protect his handler, but nothing in his training had prepared him for this. His hand instinctively tightened on the leash, though Rex hadn't moved and showed no signs of moving. Some deep instinct told him that whatever was about to happen would change everything, for this case, for this family, maybe even for his career. He'd walked into this courtroom expecting to sit quietly for 30 minutes before his own case was called. Instead, he was about to become a witness to something that would haunt him, inspire him, and ultimately redirect the entire course of his professional life. The little girl's mouth opened fully now, her voice gathering in her throat. "And then she spoke, bad dog." The words exploded from Emma's tiny mouth like a gunshot in the silent courtroom, shattering the formal atmosphere with the force of a physical blow. The sound was so unexpected, so jarring, that for a fraction of a second, everyone's brain seemed to short-circuit, unable to process what they'd just heard. Every person in courtroom 4B froze in mid-action, as if someone had pressed pause on reality itself. Sarah's attorney, Michael, stopped mid-sentence, his mouth hanging open around a word that would never be completed. The court reporter's fingers hovered motionless over her stenotype machine, suspended in the air like a pianist who'd forgotten the next note. Judge's hand, reaching for her water glass, stopped halfway across her desk. Even the bailiff, who'd been shifting his weight from one foot to the other, became a statue. Emma's small finger pointed accusingly toward the back of the room, trembling but unmistakable in its direction. Her entire arm was extended, rigid with tension, aiming directly at Officer and Rex. The stuffed rabbit she'd been clutching had fallen to the floor, forgotten in her sudden urgency to communicate something that had been locked inside her for far too long. Bad dog, she screamed again, louder this time, her voice cracking with a terror that seemed to fill every corner of the courtroom. The sound was primal, visceral, not the tantrum of a bratty child or the manipulation of a coached performance. This was raw, genuine fear mixed with something else, something that made every adult in the room feel their stomach drop, recognition. The spell of silence broke. Judge Scavell clattered to her desk, slipping from her fingers unnoticed. Sarah lurched forward in her chair with such violence that it scraped loudly against the floor. "Emma," she cried out, her voice breaking. But the bailiff was already moving, positioning himself between the plaintiff's table and the area where Emma sat, his training kicking in automatically to maintain courtroom order even though he had no idea what was happening. Officer looked down at Rex in complete confusion. The German shepherd hadn't moved a single muscle. He sat exactly as he had been sitting for the past 4 minutes, calm, professional, his tail tucked neatly around his haunches, his expression almost comically bewildered. Rex's ears were swiveling, trying to locate the source of the distress, but he showed no signs of aggression, no indication that he'd done anything to warrant being called bad. "What the?" started to say, but his words died in his throat as he watched the scene unfolding before him. Mrs. the court-appointed guardian had wrapped her arms around Emma, trying to comfort her and calm her down, but the little girl was having none of it. She twisted in the older woman's grasp, her small body surprisingly strong with panic and determination. "Bad dog hurt Emma, bad dog at Daddy's house." The words tumbled out between sobs that shook her whole frame, gasping breaths that sounded like she was drowning in air. At those words, "at Daddy's house," David Preston's face underwent a transformation that several witnesses would later describe in their testimony. The color didn't just drain from his face. It was as if someone had erased him and redrawn him in shades of gray and green. His eyes went wide, pupils dilating with what could only be described as pure panic. His mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish pulled from water, desperately trying to find oxygen that wasn't there. David's high-powered attorney noticed her client's reaction immediately. Her perfectly manicured hand shot out and gripped his forearm with surprising force, her acrylic nails digging into his suit jacket. She leaned in close, whispering urgently in his ear, her face a mask of professional concern that didn't quite hide the flash of alarm in her eyes. Whatever she was saying was lost in the chaos, but her body language screamed damage control. Emma broke free from Mrs. Gentle grip with a desperate strength that surprised everyone. Her little legs pumped as she ran, not toward the dog as several people feared, but away from her father. She ran straight toward Sarah, her light-up sneakers flashing pink and purple in frantic rhythm, her pigtails bouncing wildly, tears streaming down her flushed cheeks in rivers. "Bad dog hurt Emma, bad dog at Daddy's house. Daddy puts Emma with bad dog." The words were clearer now, more articulate despite the crying, as if speaking them was releasing something that had been compressed inside her for months. Each word was a key turning in a lock, opening doors that had been sealed shut by fear and a 3-year-old's limited ability to express complex trauma. She crashed into Sarah's legs with the full force of her small body, wrapping her arms around her mother's knees and burying her face in the fabric of her nurse's uniform. The impact nearly knocked Sarah backward, but she managed to drop to her knees instead, pulling Emma into a fierce embrace that spoke of every sleepless night, every ignored intuition, every moment she'd known something was wrong but couldn't prove it. "Baby, oh baby, I'm here, I've got you," Sarah sobbed into Emma's hair, rocking her back and forth. Her own tears were flowing freely now, mixing with her daughter's, hot and desperate and relieved all at once. Over Emma's head, Sarah's eyes found David's across the courtroom, and the look she gave him was pure, undiluted fury. David shot to his feet so quickly his chair toppled backward with a crash that made everyone jump. The expensive wooden chair hit the marble floor and splintered at one joint, pieces skittering across the polished surface. "She's lying." His voice was too loud, too desperate, pitching toward hysteria. "She's just a baby, she doesn't know what she's saying. Sarah put her up to this, it's parental alienation. Your Honor, this is exactly what we've been talking about." But even as the words left his mouth, they sounded hollow, scripted, like an actor who'd forgotten his lines and was improvising badly. His hands were shaking visibly, trembling so hard that had to grip both of his arms now to keep him from gesturing wildly. Sweat had broken out across his forehead despite the courtroom's chilly air conditioning, and a vein in his temple throbbed visibly. Judge rose slowly to her feet, and though she was not a particularly tall woman, in that moment she seemed to tower over the entire courtroom. Her face had transformed from its usual judicial neutrality into something harder, sharper, the expression of someone whose 20 years on the bench had given her an instinct for truth that went beyond evidence and testimony. Her eyes moved from Emma, still sobbing in Sarah's arms, to David, sweating and shaking at his table, to Officer and Rex at the back of the room, to the faces of everyone present. She was calculating, processing, her legal mind working through procedures and protocols, while her human heart responded to the obvious distress of a terrified child. "Bailiff," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos like a knife through silk. The single word carried such authority that everyone stopped moving, stopped talking, stopped breathing. "Seal the courtroom. No one leaves." The bailiff moved immediately to the doors, his hand on his radio. Judge's gavel came down 3 times, sharp, decisive strikes that echoed like gunshots. "This court is in immediate recess, but this is not a dismissal. Mr. Preston, you will remain seated. Ms. Your client does not move from that chair. Is that understood?" Opened her mouth to object. It was practically a reflex for her. But something in Judge's expression made her close it again and simply nod. "Officer," the judge continued, turning her attention to the back of the room, "please approach the bench with your K-9 partner. I need to understand exactly what just happened here." Stood Rex, rising smoothly beside him, and began walking down the center aisle of the courtroom. As he passed Emma, still clinging to her mother, the little girl's crying intensified momentarily before she buried her face deeper into Sarah's shoulder. Rex's ears flattened against his head, his confusion and distress at being called bad evident in every line of his body. Judge watched this interaction with laser focus, her mind already assembling pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known existed 5 minutes ago. Something was very, very wrong here. And whatever it was, it had just exploded into her courtroom with the force of 2 simple words from a 3-year-old child. The ordinary custody hearing had just become something else entirely. Judge stood behind her bench like a general surveying a battlefield, her mind racing through 20 years of legal precedent and child welfare protocols. She'd handled hundreds of custody cases, witnessed countless accusations and counter-accusations, seen parents lie with Oscar-worthy performances. But this felt different. The terror in that child's voice had been authentic, undeniable, the kind of raw fear that couldn't be coached or fabricated. "Bailiff, I want Child Protective Services on the phone immediately," she ordered, her voice crisp with authority. "Tell them we have an emergency situation requiring immediate response. Then get Detective Morales from the Special Victims Unit. Her direct line is in my contacts list." She turned to her court clerk. "Mary, call Dr. Susan Foster from the Child Advocacy Center. Tell her I need her here now, not in an hour now." The courtroom hummed with sudden activity, but Judge's attention remained fixed on the sobbing child in her mother's arms. Emma's cries had quieted to hiccuping whimpers, but her small body still trembled with aftershocks of fear. Sarah held her daughter like a lifeline, whispering soothing words that seemed inadequate for whatever trauma had just surfaced. Officer stood awkwardly near the bench with Rex, the German shepherd's tail tucked low, his normally confident demeanor replaced with visible distress at being called bad. Judge examined the dog carefully. He was clearly well-trained, calm, showing no signs of aggression whatsoever. So why had this child reacted with such terror? "Officer, has your K-9 partner ever had any incidents involving children, any complaints, any aggressive behavior?" Judge asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "No, Your Honor, never," replied firmly. "Rex has been in service for 3 years. He's been around hundreds of kids at community events, school demonstrations, hospital visits. He's never shown aggression toward anyone who wasn't an active threat. He's one of the gentlest K-9s in the county." Judge nodded slowly, her suspicion deepening. "And you've never been to Mr. Preston's residence, never worked a case involving this family?" "No, ma'am, I've never seen any of these people before today." "Then why," Judge said, more to herself than anyone else, "would a 3-year-old girl associate your dog with something at her father's house?" She let the question hang in the air like smoke, watching David Preston's face as the implications settled over the courtroom. David had collapsed back into his chair. The bailiff had retrieved a replacement after his dramatic outburst had destroyed the first one. His attorney was in full crisis mode now, her phone pressed to her ear as she whispered urgently to someone, probably a private investigator or another attorney from her firm. David himself sat with his head in his hands, his expensive suit jacket rumpled, his carefully constructed image crumbling like wet cardboard. "Your Honor, I must object to this entire proceeding," said, snapping her phone shut and rising to her feet. "My client's due process rights are being violated. There has been no formal accusation, no evidence presented, just the confused words of a toddler who—" "Sit down, Ms." Judge's voice was ice. "Right now, I'm not concerned with your client's due process. I'm concerned with a child's safety. You'll have plenty of opportunity to defend your client if and when charges are filed. But in this moment in my courtroom, a 3-year-old girl just exhibited signs of severe trauma, and I will not ignore that." The door to the courtroom burst open, and a woman in her mid-40s rushed in, her identification badge swinging from a lanyard around her neck. "Dr. Susan Foster, Child Advocacy Center." She was slightly out of breath, her graying hair pulled back in a hasty ponytail, but her eyes were sharp and professional as they swept the scene before her. "Susan, thank you for coming so quickly," Judge said. "We have a potential emergency situation. 3-year-old girl Emma Preston just had a severe reaction to a police K-9 in the courtroom. She stated, and I quote, 'Bad dog hurt Emma and bad dog at Daddy's house. I need a forensic interview conducted immediately.'" Dr. Foster's expression shifted from curious to gravely concerned in an instant. She moved toward Sarah and Emma, kneeling down to their level with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent decades working with traumatized children. "Hi there, sweetheart," she said softly to Emma, not touching her yet, respecting the child's space. "My name is Dr. Susan. I help kids talk about things that are scary or confusing. Would you like to come with me to a special room where we can talk? It has toys and books and a really comfy couch." Emma lifted her tear-stained face from her mother's shoulder and looked at Dr. Foster with red, swollen eyes. "Mommy comes too." Her voice was tiny, fragile, breaking Sarah's heart all over again. "Mommy can walk with us to the room," Dr. Foster said gently, "but when we talk, it needs to be just you and me for a little bit. Is that okay? Mommy will be right outside the door the whole time." Sarah looked at Judge, her expression desperate. "Your Honor, I don't want to let her go. What if?" "Ms. Mitchell, I understand your concern, but Dr. Foster is one of the best forensic child interviewers in the state. Emma will be safe with her, and this interview needs to be conducted properly so that whatever she tells us can be used to protect her." Judge's voice softened slightly. "I know this is terrifying, but we need to do this right." 20 minutes later, Emma sat in a room specifically designed to be non-threatening. Pastel blue walls, stuffed animals arranged on shelves, a play kitchen in one corner, and a large window that looked like a mirror from Emma's side but was actually one-way glass. Behind that glass, Judge Detective Lisa Morales, who had arrived within 15 minutes of being called, Sarah, and a video technician watched and listened as Dr. Foster worked her careful magic. Dr. Foster had started with simple rapport-building questions. "What's your favorite color? Do you like ice cream? Tell me about your stuffed rabbit." Emma's answers were hesitant at first, but the doctor's warm, unhurried manner gradually helped her relax. They colored together for a few minutes, talked about Emma's favorite cartoon characters, played briefly with a dollhouse. Then, so subtly that it was barely noticeable, Dr. Foster began to guide the conversation toward more difficult territory. "Emma, honey, in the big room before, the one with all the grown-ups, you saw a dog, didn't you?" Emma's crayon stopped moving across the paper. She nodded slowly, her shoulders tensing. "That must have been scary. Can you tell me why the dog scared you?" A long pause, Emma's small fingers gripped the crayon. "Bad dog. I see. Where did you see the bad dog before?" "At Daddy's house." The words were barely a whisper. Dr. Foster kept her expression neutral, encouraging but not leading. "What does the bad dog do at Daddy's house?" Emma's eyes filled with tears again. She abandoned the crayon and picked up a small doll from the table, hugging it against her chest. "Bad dog has big teeth. Bad dog barks really, really loud. Emma gets scared." "That sounds very scary," Dr. Foster validated. "Where is Emma when the bad dog barks?" What came next would later be described by Detective Morales as one of the most disturbing moments in her 15-year career. Emma set down the doll and moved to the dollhouse. With her small hands, she opened a door to show a tiny room, then picked up the smallest doll, a child figure. She placed the doll inside what appeared to be a closet in the dollhouse, then closed the door. "Emma goes in the box," she said, her voice flat now, almost emotionless, the tone of a child reciting something she'd experienced too many times. "Daddy says Emma is bad when Emma cries. Emma goes in the box. Bad dog stays outside the box and barks and barks. Emma gets really scared but can't get out." Behind the one-way glass, Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a sob. Detective Morales's jaw clenched tight, her pen pressing so hard against her notepad that it tore through the paper. Judge closed her eyes briefly, her worst fears being confirmed. Dr. Foster continued, her voice still gentle but each word carefully chosen for maximum clarity in the recording that would become evidence. "How long does Emma stay in the box?" "Long time. Sometimes Emma falls asleep. Sometimes Emma cries so much she gets sick." "And where is Daddy when Emma is in the box?" "Daddy watches. Sometimes Daddy takes pictures with his phone." The words hung in the air like poison. Detective Morales was already on her phone, typing out a warrant request with trembling fingers. Judge turned to the video technician. "I want every second of this interview preserved and backed up in 3 separate locations. This is now evidence in what I believe will be a criminal investigation." The interview continued for another 20 minutes, with Dr. Foster carefully documenting every detail Emma could provide. The color of the dog, black and brown like the one in the courtroom, the size of the box, Emma demonstrated with her hands, indicating something barely larger than she was, the frequency of the incidents lots and lots of times. When it was finally over and Emma was reunited with her mother in a tearful embrace, Detective Morales turned to Judge with fire in her eyes. "I'm requesting an immediate warrant to search David Preston's residence. Based on the child's statement and the specificity of her details, I have probable cause to believe evidence of child endangerment and abuse is present at that location." Judge didn't hesitate. "Granted, I'll have the warrant signed within the hour. Bailiff, take Mr. Preston into custody. He's not going anywhere until we know what's in that house." Detective Lisa Morales stood on the cracked concrete driveway of 4792 Maple Street in Valley, her latex gloves already in place, her stomach churning with a mixture of anticipation and dread. The modest single-story ranch house looked unremarkable from the outside: beige stucco walls, a brown tile roof, dying grass in the front yard that spoke of California's endless drought. A rusty basketball hoop hung at an angle over the garage door, and a few scattered children's toys lay abandoned near the front porch. To any passing neighbor, it would look like dozens of other working-class homes in the area. But Detective Morales knew that monsters rarely advertised themselves. The worst horrors she'd encountered in her 15-year career had often hidden behind the most ordinary facades. The emergency warrant had been signed by Judge at 11:47 a.m., a record time that spoke to the severity of Emma's disclosure. Now at 2:43 p.m., Morales stood with a team of 6 officers, 2 evidence technicians and animal control officer, all preparing to breach the property. David Preston sat in a holding cell back at the courthouse, his attorney screaming about illegal searches and rights violations, but Judge had been unmoved. The welfare of a child superseded procedural niceties. "Remember," Morales addressed her team, her voice steady despite the adrenaline pumping through her veins, "we're looking for evidence of child endangerment. Specifically a dog matching the child's description and any kind of enclosure or cage that could hold a 3-year-old. Photos, videos, anything on computers or phones. Treat everything as potential evidence." Officer nodded, adjusting his body camera to ensure it was recording. "The child mentioned the dog was in the backyard. Should we approach from there?" "Animal control goes first," Morales decided. "If there's an aggressive dog back there like Emma described, I don't want anyone getting hurt. You ready?" A veteran animal control officer with 20 years of experience hefted her catch pole and nodded grimly. "Let's see what we're dealing with." The team moved as one unit toward the side gate that led to the backyard. The gate was secured with a simple latch, no lock, and it swung open with an ominous creak that seemed too loud in the quiet suburban afternoon. A few neighbors had emerged from their homes, drawn by the presence of multiple police vehicles, watching with the curious mixture of concern and entertainment that always accompanied law enforcement activity in residential neighborhoods. The backyard was larger than the front, maybe 40 feet deep, with a wooden privacy fence that had seen better days. Dead grass crunched under their boots as they moved forward, and then stopped so abruptly that Officer nearly collided with her. "Jesus Christ," she whispered. In the far corner of the yard, chained to a metal stake driven deep into the ground, was a German Shepherd. But calling it simply a German Shepherd didn't capture the horror of what they were seeing. The dog was emaciated, its ribs visible through matted, filthy fur. Scars crisscrossed its body, some old and healed, others relatively fresh and still healing. Its water bowl had tipped over, the ground around it bone dry. A food bowl sat several feet away, empty except for a few flies buzzing around the residue. But the worst part was the dog's eyes. They were wild, feral, filled with a mixture of fear and rage that came from prolonged suffering and abuse. When the dog saw the humans approaching, it lunged forward with such violence that the chain snapped taut with a metallic clang, and a sound erupted from its throat that was barely recognizable as a bark, more like a scream of fury and desperation. "That animal has been tortured," said, her voice thick with emotion. She'd seen countless cases of animal abuse, but this registered high on the scale of cruelty. Systematic starvation, physical abuse, probably kept in a constant state of agitation. This dog is dangerous because it's been made dangerous. Detective Morales felt her hands clench into fists inside her latex gloves. She forced herself to breathe slowly, to maintain professional detachment, but rage burned in her chest like acid. "Can you secure it?" "I'll need backup and sedation. That dog will attack anything that comes near it. It's been trained by abuse to be a weapon." Was already on her radio, calling for additional animal control officers and a veterinary team with tranquilizers. While they waited, Morales directed her team to search the house. Officer and his partner, Officer Sandra, took the front entrance. Evidence technicians and Amy went through the back door into the kitchen. Morales herself headed for what appeared to be a bedroom. According to the floor plan they'd obtained from county records, there should be 3 bedrooms in the house. The master bedroom was a disaster: unmade bed, clothes strewn everywhere, empty beer bottles on the nightstand. The second bedroom had been converted into a home office of sorts, with a desk, a desktop computer, and filing cabinets. The evidence team would tear this apart looking for digital evidence. But it was the third bedroom that made Morales's blood run cold. From the doorway, it looked innocent enough. A child's room painted in soft pink with a small bed covered in a princess comforter, a toy box overflowing with dolls and stuffed animals, even a bookshelf with children's books arranged neatly. This was the room David Preston showed to social workers, to judges, to anyone who questioned his fitness as a father. Look, it said, I'm a good dad. I have a proper room for my daughter. But Morales had been doing this job long enough to trust her instincts, and her instincts were screaming that something was wrong. The room was too perfect, too staged. The toys looked barely touched, the books still had that crisp, never-been-read appearance. And there was a closet door that had 3 different locks on it, deadbolts that could only be opened from the outside. Amy, I need you in here now, Morales called out, her voice tight. The evidence technicians appeared within seconds, cameras already raised. Morales pointed at the closet door. Document everything before we open it. Photographs taken from multiple angles, measurements recorded. The locks themselves examined and photographed. They were new, the installation marks fresh in the door frame. Someone had recently reinforced this closet to ensure that whatever went inside couldn't get out. Morales's hands trembled slightly as she unlatched the first lock. Then the second. Then the third. The door swung open, and for a moment she couldn't process what she was seeing. Her brain refused to accept it, rejected the evidence of her own eyes, because accepting it meant acknowledging that David Preston was a monster beyond her worst imaginations. The closet had been completely modified. The normal closet rod and shelves had been removed. In their place was a cage, a dog crate designed for a large breed but reinforced with additional metal bars welded onto the frame. It was maybe 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet, barely large enough for a 3-year-old child to sit in, certainly not large enough to stand or lie down comfortably. Inside the cage, scratch marks covered every surface. Small, desperate scratches made by tiny fingernails. In one corner was a child's sock, pink with white polka dots. In another corner, evidence of urine stains that someone had tried to clean but hadn't been entirely successful. The smell was faint but unmistakable: fear and waste and desperation. "Oh my God," Amy whispered, her camera shutter clicking rapidly but her voice breaking. "He kept her in there. He actually kept that baby in a cage." Officer appeared in the doorway, took one look at the scene, and had to turn away, his hand over his mouth. Even veteran cops had their limits, and finding evidence of a child tortured in what should have been her safe space pushed past those boundaries. Detective Morales forced herself to remain professional, to compartmentalize the rage and horror so she could do her job. Document everything, every scratch mark, every stain, every single inch of this space. I want measurements showing that a 3-year-old would barely fit inside. I want chemical analysis of those stains. I want everything that will put that son of a bitch away for the rest of his natural life. Officer appeared with an iPad, her face pale. "Detective, you need to see this. We found Preston's laptop in the office. It was still on, no password protection. The idiot didn't even try to hide it." Morales followed her to the office, where the laptop sat open on the desk, its screen displaying a folder labeled Discipline. She didn't want to look. Every instinct told her that what was in that folder would haunt her for years, but she had a job to do. She clicked the folder open. Inside were hundreds of files, photos and videos, all time-stamped and dated going back 6 months. Her hand hovered over the first file, then clicked it open. The video showed Emma, barely recognizable through her tears and terror, being placed into the cage in the closet. David's voice came from behind the camera. "Bad girls who cry for mommy need to learn to behave." Then the closet door closed, the locks engaged, and the camera perspective changed. David had positioned a camera inside the closet itself, pointing at the cage. What happened next was documented in horrifying detail. Emma screaming, crying, begging to be let out. And then from somewhere close by, the sound of a dog barking, not just barking but snarling, growling, creating a soundtrack of terror. The camera angle suggested David had placed his phone on a shelf in the closet, positioned to record Emma's reaction. He had filmed her trauma for his own purposes. Whether as twisted entertainment or as psychological leverage, Morales didn't know and didn't want to know. There were dozens of these videos. Some lasted only 10 or 15 minutes. Others ran for over an hour. In later videos, Emma barely reacted anymore, sitting silently in the cage with vacant eyes, her spirit visibly breaking under repeated torture. "That's enough," Morales said, closing the laptop. Her voice sounded distant to her own ears, detached, as if her mind was protecting itself by creating distance from what she'd just witnessed. "Seize everything, every electronic device in this house, every computer, phone, tablet, camera, flash drive, everything. I want the computer crimes unit to go through every byte of data. Back in the yard, the animal control team had successfully sedated the German Shepherd and loaded it into a specialized transport vehicle. Approached Morales with tears streaming down her face, the first time Morales had ever seen the tough-as-nails officer cry. That dog didn't start out like this, said. Someone deliberately made it aggressive, starved it, beat it, probably kept it in a constant state of fear and agitation. That's not a pet, that's a weapon. And based on what you found in the house, I can guess what it was a weapon against. Detective Morales nodded, unable to trust her voice. She looked around the unremarkable suburban house at the dying grass and the rusty basketball hoop and the scattered toys. From the outside, it looked so normal. But inside, unspeakable horrors had been inflicted on an innocent child by the person who should have protected her most. Her phone buzzed, a text from Judge. What did you find? Morales typed back with shaking fingers. Everything Emma said was true, worse than we imagined. Preston is done. Holding cell at the Riverside County Courthouse was a sterile 8x10 concrete box painted in institutional beige, with a single metal bench bolted to the wall and a toilet in the corner that offered no privacy. David Preston sat on that bench at 4:15 p.m., his expensive navy suit now rumpled and stained with sweat, his carefully constructed facade completely shattered. His hands trembled uncontrollably as he stared at the scuffed floor, his mind racing through scenarios, excuses, escape routes, anything to avoid the reality that was closing in around him like a vice. His attorney sat beside him on the bench, though her body language made it clear she wanted to be anywhere else. Her suit was still immaculate, but her expression had transformed from confident legal warrior to someone who just realized her client was radioactive. She'd made 3 phone calls in the past hour, 2 to other attorneys in her firm and 1 to her malpractice insurance carrier. The writing was on the wall, written in letters so large even she couldn't deny them. They can't use any of this, David muttered for the 15th time, his voice hoarse from the panic that had been building for hours. It's an illegal search. Emma's just a baby, she doesn't know what she's saying. Sarah coached her. This is all a setup. You can fight this, right? You can make this go away. Looked at her client with barely disguised disgust. She defended plenty of guilty people in her 20-year career, that was her job and she was good at it. But there were lines even she didn't cross, and child torture was etched in stone on the wrong side of that line. Mr. Preston, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Based on what Judge has communicated to me, the police have found physical evidence at your residence that corroborates your daughter's testimony. This is no longer a custody dispute. This is a criminal investigation into felony child abuse. But you can. No, she cut him off sharply. I can't make this go away. What I can do is advise you to remain silent and not say another word to anyone, not to me, not to the police, not to other inmates if they charge you and take you to county jail. Do you understand? David's face crumpled, tears beginning to stream down his cheeks. I didn't mean to hurt her, I was just trying to discipline her. She wouldn't stop crying for her mother, she needed to learn. Stop talking, nearly shouted, standing up abruptly. Jesus Christ, David, do you have any idea what you just said to your attorney? I'm ethically obligated to keep your confidences, but I'm not obligated to help you dig your own grave. She grabbed her briefcase, her decision made. I'm withdrawing from your case. I'll file the paperwork first thing tomorrow morning. You need a criminal defense attorney and it's not going to be me. You can't abandon me, David's voice rose to a desperate wail. I'm paying you, you work for me. Not anymore. Knocked on the cell door and the bailiff opened it immediately as if he'd been waiting for her exit. She stepped through without looking back, leaving David Preston alone with the consequences of his actions for the first time in his life. In the hallway outside, leaned against the wall and took several deep breaths trying to compose herself. Judge appeared from around the corner, her black robe swishing with the speed of her approach. Ms., I need to know, did your client just make any incriminating statements to you? Shook her head. Your Honor, as much as I'd love to help bury that piece of garbage, attorney-client privilege still applies. What I will tell you is that I'm withdrawing from the case immediately, and you should interpret that however you see fit. Judge nodded slowly, understanding the subtext perfectly. Detective Morales is on her way back from the search. Based on her preliminary report, I'm issuing an arrest warrant for David Preston on multiple counts of felony child abuse, child endangerment, and animal cruelty. He won't be leaving this building as a free man. 20 minutes later, Detective Lisa Morales strode into the courthouse with the grim determination of someone who'd seen hell and come back with photographic evidence. She carried a tablet loaded with images from the search and a cardboard evidence box containing David Preston's laptop, still sealed in plastic. Behind her came officer and 2 additional officers from the Special Victims Unit. Judge had cleared her courtroom and called an emergency hearing with only essential personnel present. Herself, Detective Morales, the district attorney Karen who'd been called in from her office, Sarah Mitchell and her attorney, and the court reporter to document everything for the official record. Emma was with Dr. Foster at the Child Advocacy Center, being cared for by trauma specialists while her mother dealt with the legal proceedings. Detective Morales, Judge began formally, please present your findings from the search of David Preston's residence. What followed was a recitation of horrors that made even the experienced judge pause to collect herself multiple times. Morales walked through each discovery methodically: the abused dog in the backyard, the modified closet with the cage, the scratch marks and biological evidence, and finally the digital files on Preston's laptop. Your Honor, we found over 200 video files documenting the defendant placing his daughter in a cage, locking her in a closet, and using an aggressive, abused dog to terrorize her, Morales said, her voice professionally detached but her eyes burning with suppressed rage. The videos show premeditation and pattern. This wasn't discipline gone wrong. This was systematic psychological torture of a 3-year-old child. Sarah Mitchell, sitting in the gallery, made a sound that was somewhere between a sob and a scream. Her attorney put a steadying hand on her shoulder, but nothing could comfort her against the knowledge of what her daughter had endured. I didn't know, Sarah whispered brokenly. Oh God, I didn't know, she tried to tell me. She said bad dog at daddy's, but I thought she was just afraid of dogs. I didn't understand. Ms. Mitchell, you are not responsible for your ex-husband's actions, Judge said firmly. From everything I've seen, he deliberately hid this from you. The room he showed social workers was staged. The abuse happened behind a locked closet door. You had no way of knowing. District Attorney Karen, a sharp-featured woman in her 40s with a reputation as one of the toughest prosecutors in the county, had been taking notes throughout Morales's presentation. Now she stood, her expression carved from granite. Your Honor, based on Detective Morales's findings, I'm formally charging David Preston with multiple felony counts. 4 counts of felony child abuse causing great bodily injury, 3 counts of criminal threats, 2 counts of false imprisonment, 6 counts of child endangerment, and 3 counts of animal cruelty. Given the severity of these crimes and the defendant's access to resources, I'm also requesting that bail be set at $5 million. Granted, Judge said without hesitation. Bailiff, bring Mr. Preston to the courtroom. David Preston was led in wearing handcuffs, his face puffy from crying, his expensive suit looking like he'd slept in it for a week. When he saw the assembled group, the detective, the DA, his ex-wife's murderous expression, his legs nearly gave out. The bailiff had to physically support him to keep him upright. Judge's voice was cold as Arctic ice. David Preston, you are under arrest for multiple felony charges related to the abuse and torture of your daughter, Emma Preston. You have the right to remain silent. I strongly suggest you exercise it. You have the right to an attorney. Given that your previous attorney has withdrawn, the court will appoint a public defender if you cannot afford representation. Do you understand these rights? David nodded mutely, unable to speak. Detective Morales, there's one thing I need to understand, Judge continued. The videos on his laptop, were they just for his own purposes, or is there evidence of distribution? Morales consulted her notes and her expression darkened further. Your Honor, the Computer Crimes Unit is still analyzing his hard drive, but preliminary findings suggest he was part of an online group that shares this type of content. We found encrypted chat logs discussing discipline techniques and images that suggest other children may be involved. The FBI has been and will be taking over that aspect of the investigation. The courtroom fell silent as the implications sank in. This wasn't just one monster abusing one child. This was potentially a network of abusers, and David Preston had just become the thread that could unravel the entire web. Sarah Mitchell stood up, her voice shaking but determined. Your Honor, I want full custody. I want his parental rights terminated. I want a restraining order that keeps him away from Emma for the rest of his miserable life. And I want him to know, she turned to face David directly, her eyes blazing with a mother's fury, that his daughter was brave enough to save herself. She pointed at that dog and she found her voice, and because of her courage, you'll spend the rest of your life in prison. She won, you lost. David Preston collapsed onto the defense table, sobbing uncontrollably, the last remnants of his denial finally crumbling. His words echoed in his mind. He'd confessed to his attorney, broken down under pressure, and now his own words were damning him even beyond the physical evidence. Judge banged her gavel. David Preston, you are remanded to county jail without bail pending trial. Your parental rights are immediately suspended pending termination hearings. You are not to have any contact whatsoever with your daughter, no letters, no phone calls, no messages through third parties. If you violate this order, I will hold you in contempt and add additional charges. She paused, letting her personal feelings show for just a moment. In 20 years on this bench, Mr. Preston, you are among the worst I've encountered. Take him away. As David was led from the courtroom in chains, Sarah finally allowed herself to break down completely. Her attorney held her as she cried, tears of relief, of rage, of grief for what her daughter had endured, of gratitude that it was finally over. But it wasn't quite over yet. The trial would come, and with it, more revelations that would shock the community and the nation. 8 months crawled by like wounded animals, each day bringing new revelations that made the initial discovery seem almost tame by comparison. The trial of David Preston began on a gray February morning in 2020. The courthouse steps crowded with media vans, protesters holding signs demanding justice for Emma, and curious onlookers hopping to catch a glimpse of the man who'd become the personification of evil in Riverside County. Inside Courtroom 4B, the same courtroom where Emma had first pointed at Officer Stogg, the atmosphere was electric with tension. Sarah Mitchell sat in the front row of the gallery, flanked by her parents and her new therapist. She'd quit her nursing job 3 months earlier, unable to focus on caring for patients when her own daughter needed her so desperately. They were living on her savings and the donations that had poured in from across the country after Emma's story went national. Emma herself was not present. Judge had ruled that requiring a 3-year-old to testify would constitute additional trauma, and the video evidence was more than sufficient. But her presence was felt everywhere, in every exhibit photo, in every piece of evidence, in every face in the courtroom that had followed her story and demanded justice. David Preston sat at the defense table looking 20 years older than his 35 years. County jail had not been kind to him. Inmates had a particular hatred for child abusers, and despite being held in protective custody, David had still been attacked twice. A scar now ran from his left eyebrow to his hairline, and he walked with a slight limp from an accident in the shower that everyone knew wasn't an accident at all. His court-appointed attorney was a competent public defender doing his best with an impossible case. District Attorney Karen stood to deliver her opening statement, her charcoal suit immaculate, her expression fierce. The jury, 7 women and 5 men, ranging in age from 25 to 68, leaned forward in their seats, ready to hear what they'd been carefully shielded from during jury selection. "Ladies and of the jury," began, her voice clear and strong, "over the next few days you're going to hear testimony and see evidence that will disturb you. Some of it will make you angry. Some of it might make you physically ill. I apologize in advance for what you're about to experience, but it's necessary because Emma Preston, a 3-year-old girl who should have been playing with dolls and learning her ABCs, was instead being systematically tortured by the one person who should have protected her above all others, her father." She clicked a remote, and Emma's smiling kindergarten photo appeared on the screen, pigtails, gap-toothed grin, innocent eyes. Several jurors visibly softened at the image. "That's Emma before the abuse began," continued. "A happy, healthy toddler with her whole life ahead of her. Now let me show you what the defendant did to her." Another click, and the screen filled with a photo of the cage inside the closet, the scratch marks visible even from across the courtroom. A female juror in the front row gasped audibly. The prosecution's case was devastating in its thoroughness. Detective Lisa Morales took the stand first, walking the jury through every detail of the search: the abused dog in the backyard, the modified closet, the cage barely large enough for a child. Crime scene photos were entered into evidence, each one more damning than the last. "Detective Morales, can you explain the significance of the dog found at the defendant's residence?" asked. "The German Shepherd we found had been systematically abused, starved, beaten, kept in conditions designed to make it aggressive and unpredictable," Morales, her voice professional but her eyes hard. "Based on the video evidence we recovered, the defendant used this dog as a weapon of psychological terror against his daughter. He would place Emma in the cage, lock her in the closet, and then bring the dog close enough that she could hear it barking and snarling. Sometimes he would shake the closet door, making her think the dog was trying to get in. The child's terror was the point." David's attorney objected repeatedly, trying to exclude evidence as prejudicial or improperly obtained, but judge overruled him each time. The warrant had been solid, the evidence chain unbroken. Dr. Susan Foster, the forensic child interviewer, next about her session with Emma. The jury watched the recorded interview in complete silence, many of them with tears streaming down their faces as they heard Emma's small voice explaining how Daddy puts Emma in the box when Emma cries. "Dr. Foster, in your professional opinion, was Emma's testimony coached or fabricated?" asked. "Absolutely not," Dr. Foster replied firmly. 3-year-olds don't have the cognitive capacity to fabricate detailed, consistent accounts of abuse. The specificity of her statements, the description of the cage, the dog's appearance, the location in the closet, all of this matches the physical evidence perfectly. Additionally, Emma displayed classic trauma responses during the interview: dissociation when discussing the worst moments, physical distress when mentioning her father, and the use of third-person language. "Emma goes in the box," rather than "I go in the box," which is a common self-protective mechanism in traumatized children. The prosecution's most damning evidence came on day 3 of the trial, when computer forensics expert Timothy took the stand. The jury had been warned that what they were about to see would be disturbing, and several had brought tissues in preparation. "Mister, can you describe what you found on the defendant's laptop?" asked. Timothy, a slight man with wire-rimmed glasses, consulted his notes with visible discomfort. "We recovered 237 video files and 412 images, all documenting the abuse of Emma Preston over a period of approximately 7 months. The files were meticulously organized by date and given labels like discipline session and training." The jury was shown carefully edited clips, enough to establish the pattern of abuse without subjecting them to the full horror of what David had recorded. Even these sanitized versions were devastating. Multiple jurors were openly crying. One man in the back row looked like he might be sick. "We also recovered encrypted chat logs from an online forum where the defendant shared photos and discussed discipline techniques with other users," continued. "The FBI has identified 17 other individuals from this forum, and investigations are ongoing. The defendant was not just abusing his own child. He was part of a community that encouraged and celebrated this behavior." David's attorney did his best during cross-examination, trying to establish that David had mental health issues, that he'd been under stress from the divorce, that he needed treatment rather than punishment. But even his most sympathetic questions couldn't overcome the mountain of evidence. David himself never took the stand, advised strongly against it, knowing that anything David said would only make things worse. The defense called a psychiatrist who about David's troubled childhood and possible personality disorders, but the testimony felt hollow against the concrete evidence of what he'd done to Emma. The prosecution's closing argument was brief and brutal. "Members of the jury, this is not a complicated case," said. "David Preston took his 3-year-old daughter, a child who trusted him, who loved him, who called him daddy, and he tortured her, not once, not twice, but repeatedly, systematically over the course of 7 months. He filmed it, he shared it with other predators online, he felt no remorse. And he would still be doing it today if his daughter hadn't been brave enough to point at a police dog in a courtroom and say 2 words, 'Bad dog.'" She paused, letting that sink in. Emma Preston saved herself. She found her voice when she saw that German Shepherd and recognized something that reminded her of her torment. In that moment, she became her own hero. Now it's your turn to be heroes for her. Find this man guilty on every single count. Give Emma the justice she deserves. The jury deliberated for 4 hours and 12 minutes, longer than expected, but only because they'd reviewed every piece of evidence methodically, wanting to ensure their verdict was unassailable on appeal. When they returned, the forewoman, a 62-year-old retired teacher named Williams, stood with the verdict form in her trembling hand. Judge asked David to rise, and he did so with visible difficulty, his legs barely supporting him. "On the count of felony child abuse causing great bodily injury, how do you find?" "Guilty." "On the count of criminal threats, how do you find?" "Guilty." The guilty verdicts came one after another, 12 counts in total, each one landing like a hammer blow. David collapsed into his chair after the 6th count, sobbing uncontrollably. Sarah Mitchell, watching from the gallery, felt no satisfaction, no triumph, only a hollow relief that it was finally over. Judge scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks later, though the outcome was never in doubt. California's sentencing guidelines for child abuse were severe, and David's case had aggravating factors that would push his sentence to the maximum. On a cold March morning, Judge pronounced sentence, 18 years in state prison with no possibility of parole before serving at least 15 years. David's parental rights were permanently and irrevocably terminated. He would be required to register as a sex offender upon release, though everyone in the courtroom knew he'd be elderly by then if he survived prison at all. "Mr. Preston," Judge said, looking down at the broken man before her, "you took something precious and innocent and you destroyed it for your own twisted purposes. You have earned every single day of the sentence I'm imposing. I hope you spend those years thinking about the daughter whose childhood you stole, whose trust you betrayed, whose nightmares you created. Court is adjourned." As David was led away in chains for the last time, Sarah finally allowed herself to believe it was truly over. The legal battle had ended. Now the real work of healing could begin. 3 years later, on a brilliantly sunny Saturday in June 2023, Emma Preston, now Emma Mitchell, her last name legally changed to match her mother's, stood in the backyard of their new home in California. At 6 years old, she'd grown taller, her hair now reaching past her shoulders instead of being tied up in pigtails. She wore a purple sundress covered in butterflies, and her face bore an expression of cautious excitement as she watched her mother hang birthday decorations on the patio. "Mommy, how many people are coming?" Emma asked, her voice clear and strong, so different from the frightened whisper it had been 3 years ago in that courtroom. "About 15, Sarah replied, securing a happy 6th birthday banner to the pergola. Your grandparents, Uncle Michael and Aunt Lisa, some friends from school, and a few special guests. She smiled at her daughter, seeing traces of the carefree child Emma was slowly becoming, mixed with shadows of the trauma she still carried. The journey from that February courtroom to this June birthday party had been long and painful. Sarah had sold their old house, too many bad memories, and moved 40 miles south to where she'd found work at a smaller hospital with more manageable hours. The donations that poured in after Emma's story went viral had been placed in a trust fund for Emma's future therapy and education, managed by a lawyer who specialized in protecting child abuse survivors. Emma attended therapy twice a month with Dr. Santos, a child psychologist who specialized in trauma recovery. The nightmares had decreased from nightly occurrences to maybe once or twice a month. Emma no longer wet the bed. She'd made friends at her new school, Carson Elementary, though she still had moments where she'd shut down emotionally, retreating into herself when something triggered memories of the closet, the cage, the barking. But she was healing. Slowly, painfully, with setbacks and breakthroughs in equal measure, Emma was reclaiming her childhood. The doorbell rang at 2:00 p.m. sharp, and Emma ran to answer it with Sarah close behind. Standing on the front porch was Officer Jake, now retired from active duty but wearing his old uniform for the occasion. Beside him, on a perfectly executed heel command, sat Rex, a bit grayer around the muzzle now but still dignified and alert. Emma stopped in the doorway, her body tensing automatically at the sight of the German Shepherd. Sarah placed a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder, feeling the initial fear ripple through the small frame. But then Emma took a deep breath, just like Dr. Santos had taught her, and slowly approached. "Hi, Officer Jake," Emma said softly. "Hi, Rex." Knelt down to Emma's level, his smile warm and encouraging. "Happy birthday, Emma. Rex and I brought you something special." He pulled out a wrapped gift from behind his back, a stuffed German Shepherd puppy with kind, soft eyes, nothing like the monster from her nightmares. Emma took the gift carefully, examining the plush toy. "Thank you," she said, then surprised everyone by stepping forward and gently patting Rex on the head. The real dog remained perfectly still, his tail wagging slowly in encouragement. "Good dog," Emma whispered, and Sarah had to turn away to hide her tears. This moment, Emma touching a German Shepherd voluntarily, calling it a good dog, represented years of therapy, countless hours of exposure therapy with specially trained dogs, and Emma's incredible courage in facing her fears rather than letting them control her life. Other guests arrived in a steady stream. Emma's school friends brought brightly wrapped presents and enough energy to power a small city. Sarah's parents, Emma's grandparents, brought a cake shaped like a castle, Emma's current obsession. And then came another special guest, Detective Lisa Morales, carrying a framed photograph. "Emma, I wanted to give you this," Morales said, kneeling down like had. The photograph showed Emma as she looked now smiling at the camera, standing between Sarah and Officer with Rex sitting calmly beside them. It had been taken just last month during a special visit arranged by Dr. Santos. "This is to remind you that you're brave. You saved yourself and you helped us protect other kids too." Because that was the other lasting impact of Emma's case. The FBI investigation that followed David Preston's arrest had led to the identification and prosecution of 17 other child abusers across the United States. Online networks had been dismantled. Children had been rescued from situations similar to Emma's. The case had become a training example in police academies, social work programs, and family court systems nationwide. A stark reminder of how abuse could hide behind ordinary facades and how important it was to listen when children spoke. Officer had found his retirement calling in the aftermath of Emma's case. He'd established Rex's Voice, a nonprofit foundation that trained therapy dogs specifically to work with child abuse survivors. The program paired rescued dogs, many of them former abuse victims themselves, with traumatized children, helping both heal together. Traveled across California giving lectures to law enforcement agencies about trauma-informed policing and the unexpected ways that working animals could trigger or reveal abuse histories. "You know what the amazing thing is," told guests at the party, watching Emma play with her friends in the backyard. "Emma doesn't just survive, she thrives. That's the real victory. David Preston tried to break her spirit, but she's proof that children are more resilient than we give them credit for. She's not just a victim, she's a survivor, and now she's becoming a thriver." Sarah had become an advocate for family court reform in the 3 years since that terrible Tuesday. She before the California state legislature about the need for better screening processes in custody disputes, mandatory training for judges on recognizing signs of abuse, and faster response times when children exhibited behavioral changes during visitation. Assembly Bill 2847, nicknamed Emma's Law, had passed 6 months earlier. requiring family court judges to receive annual training in child trauma recognition, and mandating immediate investigation when children under 5 exhibited signs of severe distress related to custody arrangements. She'd also joined a support group for parents of abuse survivors, leading monthly meetings where mothers and fathers could share their experiences, their guilt, their struggles. "I didn't know" remained Sarah's recurring nightmare, those 3 words that haunted her in quiet moments. But her therapist had helped her understand that David had been a master manipulator, that the staged bedroom and careful deception weren't failures on her part, but calculated cruelty on his. As the party wound down and Emma opened her presents with genuine delight, art supplies, books, a bicycle with training wheels, a telescope for stargazing, Sarah reflected on how far they'd come. Emma would never forget what happened to her. The scars would always be there, visible in her occasional need for reassurance, in her dislike of loud noises, in her fear of enclosed spaces. But she was learning to live with those scars rather than being defined by them. That evening, after the guests had left and Emma was tucked into bed clutching her new stuffed German Shepherd, Sarah sat on the back porch with a cup of tea and looked up at the stars. Her phone buzzed, a text from Detective Morales. "Just got word. David Preston was attacked in prison again. He's in the medical ward, thought you should know." Sarah felt nothing at the news, no satisfaction, no sympathy, just a hollow acknowledgement that David was facing his own consequences. She'd stopped thinking about him months ago, stopped letting him occupy space in her mind rent-free. He was irrelevant now, a chapter closed, a monster locked away where he could hurt no one else. What mattered was Emma. What mattered was the little girl sleeping peacefully upstairs, who'd been brave enough to point at a police dog in a courtroom and speak 2 words that saved not just her own life but potentially dozens of others. What mattered was that Emma had found her voice that day, and though it had taken years of therapy and love to strengthen that voice, it grew louder every day. Sarah heard movement behind her and turned to see Emma standing in the doorway, rubbing her eyes. "Can't sleep, baby." "I had a good dream," Emma said, which was remarkable in itself. Her dreams were so rarely good. "I dreamed that Rex and I were playing fetch and I wasn't scared at all." Sarah opened her arms and Emma climbed into her lap, still small enough to fit perfectly. They sat together under the stars, mother and daughter, survivor and supporter, looking toward a future that finally seemed brighter than the past. "You know what, Emma?" Sarah whispered into her daughter's hair. "You're the bravest person I know." Emma was quiet for a moment, then said something that made Sarah's heart both break and soar. "I wasn't brave that day, Mommy. I was just really, really scared, but I said the words anyway." And that, Sarah realized, was the truest definition of courage, not the absence of fear, but the decision to speak despite it. Emma had done that at 3 years old in a courtroom full of strangers. She'd pointed at a dog that reminded her of her tormentor, and she'd found 2 words that changed everything. Those 2 words had brought a monster to justice, reformed a broken system, rescued other children, and ultimately saved Emma's own life. They'd proven that even the smallest voice, when brave enough to speak, could shatter the silence that allowed evil to flourish. "Good dog," Emma had said tonight, patting Rex's head, reclaiming those words from fear and transforming them into healing. 2 words had condemned, 2 different words had begun to heal. And somewhere in between, a little girl had found not just her voice but herself.